I'm Linda Nickell, and welcome to the Happiness Hour. Every Wednesday, hobbyists to full-time professional photographers meet here to connect, inspire, and create. Our guest speakers share images, photography tips, and their stories of inspiration to help you improve your own photography skills. An updated list of presentations has been added to the schedule on my website at lindanickell.com, as well as the links to previous sessions on YouTube. Tonight's guest is Gina Yo. Gina is a landscape photographer based in Calgary. In tonight's presentation, The Passion Within, from mom photographer to landscape photographer, and the lessons learned. In her presentation, Gina shares her passion for photography and discusses her evolution from childhood into mom photographer, and now a professional landscape photographer. As a photography mentor and educator in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. If you're on Instagram, look for her at Gina Yo. That's Gina, GINAYEO _photography. And on her website at ginayo.com. So welcome to the Happiness Hour, Gina.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for saying yes to a complete stranger, because you and I do not know each other, and I what's that word? I think it's like I just cold called you and said, "Hi, Gina, my name's Linda, and this is what I do. Would you be interested in coming?" And you said yes, and I'm like, it always surprises me and tickles me and gets me really excited, especially when strangers say yes to something that they don't know what they're getting into, and you just went all in. So I so appreciate you doing this for us.
Not a problem. I am happy to be here and I will talk about photography forever. So thanks for the invite.
Yes. So, okay. So I did just a little preliminary intro. So if you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself, because sometimes you're like, hey, you completely missed this, and this is really important to kind of know who I am and what I'm doing. So feel free. I'm pretty much going to hand this room over to you. And if you want to take over the screen, it's yours.
Perfect. Thank you. I will do that.
Hey.
So yes, thank you for that intro. And tonight's presentation is indeed, I'll be talking a little bit about my journey from mom photographer to now professional landscape photographer, as well as share some of the lessons that I have learned moving from photography of my children into landscape photography. So yes, hello and welcome to everybody. Thank you for tuning in to listen to me talk about my passion, which is photography. And yeah, Linda, thank you. You did a great introduction for who I am. I currently reside in Calgary, Alberta, and really I'm a 45-minute drive from the Canadian Rocky Mountains. So it's my playground and it's a pretty nice backyard to have, I can tell you that. And so yes, I am a professional landscape photographer. My business is based all around landscape photography, and my focus is landscape photography. I mentor and then also educate mostly female photographers, but I do have online opportunities in which is mixed gender as well. So I just want to share, a little bit about my focus and kind of what I do day to day, and where my passion for photography is sort of embedded into. And I love sharing the beauty in this natural world. There is so much just beauty out there. And I love capturing it and bringing it home and sharing that with, friends and family and those on Instagram. It's really exciting to see the artwork that nature can create. And, there's a lot of passion behind that when I get to share what I see and what I experience. My focus is also inspiring and educating photographers to embrace their interest in photography and to improve their skills so that they fall in love with photography as well. I know firsthand how much joy photography brings to me, and just the friendships and the connections and the community and the peace and the health that I've gotten from photography. And I love inspiring and encouraging others to explore their passion. And then another one of my passions and my focus right now is building community. And so I do a lot of work locally with, especially with women, and I have free nights where, we go out into the mountains together, and we get to spend some time connecting and, taking care of ourselves and enjoying the company of like-minded creators. So that's basically my focus right now. Okay, so my passion. Well, photography started for me when I was a child. My father was my inspiration, and he was our family photographer. So we could go nowhere. He always had his camera in hand. And my family, we loved camping, and so we would hop into our motorhome and literally drive off into the sunset, which was west and which was the Canadian Rocky Mountains. And my dad loved photographing the Canadian Pacific Railway. And I remember when he gave me my very first little film camera. And he'd run off after a train, and I would run off into the forest, and I would photograph little animals that I found, or wildflowers, or creeks. And I remember the joy that I felt when I would get a roll of film back, and I would carefully press it into my albums. And I think that's really where my passion began, was just as a child. And then as I moved into, you know, a young adulthood, I ended up picking up a point and shoot. And so I moved into that, and just friends and vacations and that sort of thing. And then I got married and I had a daughter, and everything changed for me. Her little moments were going by so quickly, and I'm like, I have to photograph these. I had this little spark inside of me that I needed to sort of fuel and nurture. And at that point in time, I picked up my very first DSLR, and everything has changed since then. My love of photography and my constant need to kind of grow my skills and get better at what I do and share my passion with others has really just bloomed from that moment. And so I began photographing my children, and I began capturing all of those everyday little moments, from, those chubby little fingers to the, little wisps of hair. And you can see in these images, ice cream cones, like nothing was off limits. I loved capturing them, but they grow. And so then I sort of moved into more environmental portraiture of my children. We are big campers and hikers, and we spend a lot of time in the Canadian Rockies. And so as they grew, they weren't, those little moments weren't as cute anymore. And so I moved more into sort of the environmental portraits of them kind of off in the forest or the field, and even more into some posing type of stuff. And imagery. And then I thought, well, my children aren't always around me. What am I going to do now? And that's where I started exploring landscape photography. Now, when I started my landscape photography journey, I was a fairly established mom photographer. I'd been published several times internationally. I'd worked with Nikon. I was very active in teaching and mentoring mom photographers. And so I thought, you know what? I got this landscape photography thing. This is simple, it's easy, I'm gonna rock this. Well, so that didn't really happen. I love showing these images because I think sometimes when people enter into photography and even a different genre, they're like, "This, I got this. I'm gonna rock it. It's gonna be simple and easy," but it's not. And these were the very first images that I captured in 2015 when I started in landscape photography. Um, and I even printed the image that is on the far right of the screen. And I was really proud about this image. And I keep it because it reminds me of where I have come from and how hard learning landscape photography is. Yeah, so tonight, I want to talk to you about the top 4 lessons that I have learned in moving from mom photographer into landscape photographer. And we're going to explore a little bit about the gear. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the difference in camera settings, as well as the lessons that I've had to learn in how to create a landscape image. And then as well, I want to talk a little bit about subject identification and composition in landscape photography. Okay. So let's dive right into lesson number 1, gear. So I have had to learn a little bit about gear. Now, in my portraiture of my children, my favorite lenses was my 35 millimeter, and it was a prime lens, and I would use that almost solely indoors. And then outdoors, I actually love to use my 105 macro outdoors for my children. Now, neither of those lenses are really landscape lenses. And so I have had to learn that when it comes to landscape lenses, typically wide angle lenses are fantastic. And also with my children, I would never carry around a tripod, but it's truly a very useful tool to have as a landscape photographer. And then I've also learned that filters are super useful in landscape photography. So that's going to be your polarizer and your neutral density. Now, I want to really make a point here that you can definitely get started in landscape photography with the camera gear that you already own. You don't need to go out and purchase wide angle lenses or purchase even a tripod and filters. And I actually really highly recommend that you just get out there. Just if landscape photography is something that you're interested in, pick up the camera you have, even if it's just a smartphone, and go out and start capturing nature. And you'll feel it inside of you if it's something that you are connecting with and you love. And then you can just grow in your equipment as your skills grow. Okay, I want to share a little bit with you. I always get this question, what do you carry with you? Like, what's inside your bag? So inside my bag, I have taken a photo of most of what goes into my bag. I carry 2 bodies with me. I carry my Nikon Z7 II, and on that body, I usually have my wide angle 14 to 24. And then I also carry a second body, which is my D10. And on that body is most often my telephoto, so my 70 to 200. And the reason I do that is I really like to be able to capture those wide angle scenes, but then I like to have really quickly available to me the possibility to do telephoto. I love wide angle scenes. And so I almost have to kind of remind myself that there's beauty in the details as well. And so I keep that second body handy with my telephoto so that I can capture those beautiful details as well. Now, I can also use my second body to capture things like time lapses. And I can, just set that up and let that go as a time lapse. And so I really like having my second body as an option. So when it comes to my core landscape photography lenses, it's going to be my 14 to 24, my 24 to 70, and then my 70 to 200. Those are almost always with me inside my bag. And then if I am doing any sort of macro work, I really like having my 50 millimeter with me. I love free lensing. It's beautiful. And so I often have that with me, as well as my 105 for any sort of macro work. And I also use multiple filters, polarizer, neutral density, as well as soft grad neutral density filters. And I use a intervalometer, several intervalometers. And I also have a move, shoot, move star tracker that I take with me for many of my night images. Okay. So let's move into that second lesson that I had to learn. And it was all about those camera settings. So I have once I learned how to use manual mode, I photographed my children in manual mode. And that translated really well over to landscape photography, because I do recommend that you use manual mode in landscapes. It just gives you a lot more control over capturing those high quality and well exposed images. Now in portraiture, I would shoot super wide open. So I loved those apertures of 2.0, 2.2, 2.8. Those were kind of my go-to apertures. And then of course, I would use as high as an ISO as was needed to balance out my exposure triangle with those faster shutter speeds. And so my children were always moving. And so indoors, if they were sitting quietly, my shutter speeds would be about, 1/250th of a second, or if they're outside running around, 800, 1000, sort of around those more wildlife shutter speeds with my wild children. And that is so different in landscape photography. And so I had to kind of wrap my head around the difference in those camera settings, and how smaller apertures, or those mid-range apertures, are actually best in landscape photography, and use of a very low ISO, which then of course results in those slower shutter speeds. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the why behind those camera settings in landscape photography. I love to know the reason why you're doing something. And so I want to share that a little bit with you here tonight. So mid-range apertures, why? Why do we use those in landscape photography? Well, they first of all give that greater depth of field. So you're gonna more likely have focus from the front of the frame all the way through the back of the frame. And they also result in those sharper images, because when it comes to zoom lenses, those mid-range apertures are going to be sharper for you compared to those apertures that are really wide or really small at either end of the scale. Now, low ISO. Well, why do we use a low ISO? Low ISO images that are created have less noise in them. And so it's always best, if you can, to use your camera's lowest native ISO, or the ISO that's lowest to get you really high quality results. And then of course, when you're setting up your exposure in a manual mode, you're going to end up with those slower shutter speeds. And the slower shutter speeds are going to help you get a well exposed image, but it's also in landscape photography going to help you be a little bit more creative. And so I want to talk a little bit more about creative shutter speed. So, in landscape photography, creative shutter speed is actually called long exposure photography. And I always encourage everyone to play around with shutter speed. One of my very favorite things to do is we don't have big ocean waves or anything like that here, but we'll get some lapping waves coming into different environments, like you can see the image here on the left side of the screen. And I played around a little bit with shutter speed, and I settled on this 1/6 of a second when it came to the shutter speed. I really like how the water was slowed down a little bit, but you can still see that texture. And I liked the match between the texture in the foreground waves and then those really stormy, there was a really big storm coming in, and you can kind of see that there in the distance. And so I wanted to kind of portray that movement and that sense that there was something happening, or there was a little bit of an energy. And so I really liked this frame where the water was kind of coming up and splashing over the rock. And I was able to achieve that just by experimenting a little bit with shutter speed. Now, the image on the right, again, this was a little bit more, the water was a little bit rougher. That you can tell there's no pristine reflection, but it was a warm evening, and it was so peaceful and beautiful, and the winds were softly blowing, and there was really nobody around. And I wanted to portray this sense of peace and calm. And so I was able to do that through shutter speed and using a 50-second exposure time. And it kind of pulled out a little bit more of the cloud movement and just gives a little bit of a more peaceful, calming sort of effect. And so I always encourage photographers to don't be afraid of experimenting with shutter speed and thinking about how shutter speed can impact mood within a landscape scene. Okay. Now, there's always exceptions to the rule in photography, all the time. And one of those exceptions is night landscape photography. So night landscape photography, you're not going to use the typical landscape settings. What's going to change is you're actually going to want to look at using those higher ISOs and those wider apertures. You need to let a little bit more light into your camera in order to get a well exposed image. Now, shutter speed kind of stays the same. You're going to be using those slower shutter speeds. And when it comes to stars, you can certainly use longer shutter speeds. For example, the image where the stars are trailing with the three mountains together, that would have been a longer exposure. And then if you want more static stars, then you're going to probably be around that 15-ish seconds for most sort of modern day mirrorless type of high-end DSLR cameras. So that's definitely a bit of an exception to the rule. Okay, so when I was a mom photographer, basically my goal was to capture my subjects, which were of course my children, that they needed to be well exposed. And so I would focus my settings around them and their skin tone. And if I was clipping or losing detail in my shadows or blowing out highlights, actually blowing out highlights I didn't mind at all, because it would create this beautiful bokeh, light bokeh through trees or grasses or whatnot. But when I moved into landscape photography, and I captured images like the example, the number one example, and I would, expose for sort of those shadows and those midtones. Well, I would lose detail in the sky. And I was like, well, that's yuck. I don't want that to be happening. So then I'd be like, okay, well, maybe I'll set exposure for my sky, which is the second example here on the screen. And I wasn't happy with that either, because then I was losing a whole lot of detail in my shadows. So I really had to learn what dynamic range is. And, for anyone watching this who doesn't know what a dynamic range is it is your camera's ability to capture shadows, midtones, and highlights. Now, our cameras are limited in the ability to capture full dynamic range. Our eyes are way more advanced than our cameras. And so I had to learn as a landscape photographer how to capture images that had a full dynamic range. Now, one thing that I really had to start looking at, before I would look at my histogram and I would, kind of like, oh, okay, as long as it looks okay, I wouldn't worry about things that I have to worry about as a landscape photographer. So before I move a little bit more into histograms, I just want to explain what a histogram is. And a histogram represents the light in the scene on a graph. And so in number one, the example here, you can see that this histogram is a representation of the image to the right where the sky has been blown out. Now, just by looking at this histogram, I can see that the graph is climbing the right-hand side of the wall. So I know without even looking at the image that this image has lost detail in highlights. And then the histogram example in number two, I can see that my graph is pulled away from the right-hand side of the wall, which is great. I have detail in my highlights, but I'm losing all of that detail in my shadows because my histogram is climbing on the left side of the wall. So what I want to try and achieve as a landscape photographer is I want a histogram that looks more like number three. So that's a histogram that's pulled away from the left side of the wall and the right side of the wall. And this is something that I definitely had to learn and to watch out for in my landscape images. But as I mentioned earlier, our cameras can't always capture full dynamic range. And so I would try and figure this out in the scene. And then I was like, well, now what? What do I do now when my camera can't capture all the details that I want it to? Okay, well, so what you can do and what I had to learn how to do is I had to learn how to troubleshoot dynamic range. And so tonight I want to share with you two really good ways in which you can address dynamic range in the field right there and then, so that you have all of the details from shadows into the highlights of your image. And that's going to be number one, use graduated neutral density filters. And so sometimes I'll get the question will be like, well, Gina, why don't we just bracket our images? And I'm going to talk about that next. But the reason I always suggest graduated neutral density filters is because there's the potential to just plainly save you time. When you are capturing bracketed images, you're going to have to do a little bit of exposure blending, whereas with the graduated neutral density filter, it's going to help you capture a solid straight out of camera image right then and there. Now, for those of you who aren't super familiar with graduated neutral density filters, I do have a picture of one here. And you can see there's a rectangle filter in this scene where part of it's clear and part of it's dark. And that darker area is going to be positioned, it's going to be slid into a filter holder and just positioned, say, for example, over the sky. And so the image that I have here, that's exactly what I did. I used my graduated neutral density filter, I slid it in, and that darkened my sky enough that I was able to acquire an image, just one single image that I didn't need to blend together in post-processing. So my first go-to in dealing with dynamic range is always going to be those graduated neutral density filters. Now, my second technique is going to be bracketing. And bracketing can be executed in a couple of different ways. You can automatically set up bracketing in your camera. And so when you set exposure, what you want to do is in the bracketing settings of your camera, you want to tell your camera to capture, maybe 2 more images, maybe 4 more images based on half a stop, 0.7 of a stop, a full stop apart from where you're setting your settings. And your camera then will automatically run through that. However, for most camera manufacturers or camera users, I actually don't recommend automatic bracketing. And the reason I don't recommend this is because you really don't need all of those frames. You just need a solid highlight exposure and a solid shadow exposure. So 2 exposures, and that's it. And what I was finding is sometimes when people were setting up their bracketing, they were kind of just trusting their camera. Again, it's an automatic mode. They were saying, okay, I'm going to dial in 3 different shots, a stop apart, and the camera would have at her. And then they would get home and then they would be like, oh no, I didn't set my neutral exposure properly. So I really don't have a good highlight exposure and a good shadow exposure. And so I teach and I recommend manual bracketing. And all that is it is exposing for your highlights and then immediately afterwards exposing for your shadows and then capturing 2 identical images, and that's it. Now, as a word of caution here, I'm not sure how many Canon users we have out there. Canon is a whole different ballgame. And that's because Canon doesn't read light off the active focal point. It's going to read light from the center of your camera. And so for most Canon users, I actually do recommend you either set exposure for your highlights, capture your image, and then stop down 3 stops and capture an image and kind of just do that math in your head or do the clicks through your shutter speed. Or you can set up a bracketing, an automatic bracketing inside your camera. So that's my little note on Canon there, because it throws a little bit of a wrench into everything. And so troubleshooting dynamic range was just a huge mountain, excuse my pun, but I had to really learn how to address that. And it was so different moving from a mom photographer into landscapes and not really understanding the role that dynamic range had in creating an image. Okay, let's move right into lesson number 3. And I want to talk a little bit here about image creation. When I was capturing my children, I really had no plan. We would go for our walks in the afternoon and we'd go hunt for fairies and frogs, or, we go out and pick wildflowers or look for birds or whatever it was we were doing. And there was no plan. I would just go and we would do our thing. But landscape photography is very different. And so what I would do is I would arrive at a scene and I would be so excited and so overwhelmed by the beauty that I would just rush right in and I would start capturing images. And I ended up with images that looked like the images I first showed you earlier on tonight when I first started. They were all over the place. There was no real plan on capturing them. And so nowadays, I teach photographers that landscape photography is actually a series of steps. Now, why? Why do I teach photographers that there is a series of steps? And the reason for this is it really does help keep photographers from becoming frustrated and becoming disappointed in their images. Because yes, sometimes you're lucky. Sometimes you can just kind of run off into a scene and capture it and you get a really good photo. But landscape photography really is a genre that does require a lot of technique. And so if you remember certain steps and move through that process and repeat it over and over again, it simplifies things so that you can reduce any sort of disappointment or frustration in your images. But it also gives you a sense of calm when you're out there because you know what you need to do next to capture your image. And you can really become very immersed in a scene and really enjoy the moment. I don't want to see anyone frustrated or disappointed with their photography because really spending time in nature is can bring you so much joy, and it can really improve your physical and your mental health. And following this system, I hope will help you really immerse yourself and find the joy that is within just being out in nature and the moments that you're able to capture. Okay, so I'm going to move through these. So step number one is simply preparing and planning. And, that's everything from preparing yourself to preparing your gear. And I always kind of get asked, what apps do you like to use? Like, how do you like to plan? And these are just a few of my favorite apps. So Photo Pills I use constantly in my landscape photography. It's my go-to app for pretty much everything. I really like Windy. There is a cloud overlay in the free version of Windy, and it really helps me look for pockets of light. Sometimes the weather in the Canadian Rockies it's different from second to second, no joke. And so I can drive 5 minutes and the light will be incredible, and then I can drive 5 minutes and it's socked in darkness. So Windy really does help me pinpoint those pockets of good light, and I really like using it in my photography. Space Weather Live is my go-to app for all things aurora. If you ever have the opportunity to photograph the aurora or are around when there's a storm, Space Weather Live will help keep you aware of when you should go out and when it's okay to just stay home and get some sleep. And then Google Earth is another one of my favorite planning apps. I love being able to visit a place before even getting there and kind of look where I should be parking, where trailheads are, where I need to go to get to my location. Now, step number 2, location scouting. I highly recommend that you always location scout. Now, this can happen before arrival, or it can happen at arrival. And so I always recommend to photographers who want to capture landscapes that you arrive about an hour to an hour and a half before your intended time to photograph. And that's simply to just walk around and to look at the scene and to think about what you want to tell, what's the story, what's happening in the scene, and leave your camera in the bag. Don't take it out like I used to and rush off and start capturing images. And just doing this will really help you create the kind of images that you want and your vision and sort of what speaks to you in the moment. Okay, step number 3 is a little bit to sort of piggyback off what I had just said, is just simply setting up composition. So when you're walking around, look for compositions that are interesting and that you are drawn to. And then look for alternative compositions as well, and think about ways that you can be creative or try something that maybe you're not used to. You know, maybe you're a photographer that's drawn to leading lines, and so those come so naturally to you. But maybe you want to improve your ability to frame a scene. And so you're going to look for some alternative compositions and sort of grow and enhance your skills as a landscape photographer. Now, step number 4 is the work part. So that's the part where you get to set up your tripod, you get to make sure it's stable, you're gonna attach your accessories, so any filter holders that you might be using, ready your filters, attach any intervalometers or shutter release cables that you have, set your white balance. A lot of landscape photographers use auto white balance. I actually recommend Kelvin because I think it gives you a lot of control over that straight out of camera color. You're going to look for those ideal exposure settings, and then you're going to set focus and capture your image. Step number 5 is always review your image, and not just your image, because your previews are based on the brightness level that you have your LCD screen set to. And so you may think that, oh, wow, this image looks fantastic, but it may actually not be well exposed. So I always recommend when you're previewing your images, if you have a mirrorless, then you'll have your histogram on your LCD. So you're kind of a little bit of a step ahead. But if you're previewing your image afterwards, check your histograms and look for those really solid histograms like we've already discussed, where you're lifting those shadows off the left side and that top side. And if you can't, go back and take another exposure that will give you a well exposed either shadow or highlight exposure. And then once you've done that, repeat it. Do it all over again. Try something different. Push yourself to experiment and play around, because that I always go and I capture my safe image. And I got my nice wide angle safe image, and I'm really happy with that. But then I step out of my comfort zone and I try a different focal length, or I try a different perspective, or I try a different composition. Because in those moments, you are going to learn as a photographer, and you're going to get better at what you do. Once you get home, post-processing is going to be your final step. I am a big believer that post-processing is an integral part of landscape photography. Now, you don't have to, swapping composites and doing all of these different things to make a great image. You can do very simple tweaks, but post-processing is where you get to embrace your inner artist. And it's there, I know it is. If you're a photographer, you have an inner artist, and you get to nurture that part of finalizing and creating an image that speaks to who you are as a photographer and ultimately as an artist. Okay, so really quickly, in case you want to take a screenshot or want to write this down, the steps for successful landscape photography are preparing and planning, location scouting, setting up your composition, preparing your camera, reviewing your image to make sure that you have all the data that you need, and then repeating that process again on the scene, and then of course finalizing your image in post-processing. Okay, let's move into that final lesson that I had to learn moving from mom photographer into landscape photographer. And that was the importance of identification of my subject and then as well composition. So in portraiture, I think about composition a little bit. I had my subject and, I follow him or her around and photograph things. But if I messed up, I had that fail safe that any sort of human element in an image is usually a very high attractant. And so visually, if I have a human, it's probably going to connect with people on some level because we're humans and we connect with other humans. Whereas landscape photography is very different. And it's really important to train your eye to find a subject and then develop a composition or almost like a story around your subject. And so I know I've said this several times. The image here at the top is a really good example of when I would just rush out into the scene and I'd plop my camera down and I was so overwhelmed by the beauty, I would just start photographing things. But this top image is really lacking in a solid composition and in me identifying my subject. My mountain on the left has been cropped quite awkwardly, and it kind of looks like the range in the middle is my subject, but it's very small in comparison to the mountain that again has been cropped quite awkwardly on the right hand side. And I have a lovely reflection and there's lovely light and there's a nice little leading line kind of happening here. But if I had taken the time to identify my subject in this location, I would have captured an image like the second image. It's exactly the same location. And all I did was I just shifted my perspective and I made sure that my subject took up a very good portion of the frame. So I'm really leaving no question as to what is the subject in this image. Whereas the first image, there's a whole lot of question as to what's going on here, what's the subject, and your eye is kind of bouncing around. Whereas the second image is very much more, it's calming, and there's a center focal point with the light. And it's just executed much better when you're able to sort of identify your subject. Now, after you've identified your subject, it's really important to consider supporting subjects. As a mom photographer, I never thought about supporting subjects. I didn't care. It was only about my main subject. And so this is something that I really had to learn as a landscape photographer, is once I identify my subject, what other elements can I infuse into the scene in order to tell a story? Is there mood? Is there atmosphere? Is there something interesting that I can incorporate that will help draw attention into my frame? And so I had arrived at this particular scene and I arrived before sunset, and I noticed immediately these really beautiful logs which had melting on top of them that looked like these wild mushrooms. And so I really wanted to infuse those and that sense of artistry and creativity. I felt that it was such a good match with all of this beautiful ice detail. And so I found this particular mushroom and I noticed that the ice around it almost looked like a heart. And so I fell in love with this scene and I thought, I really want to capture, my love for these mountains and my passion for photography and landscape photography. And there's this heart and these beautiful elements. And so I created the supporting elements and infused those into this image very purposefully in a way that spoke to me. And now not everybody maybe might connect with my story, but that's okay with me. I have very purposefully composed this image in a way that connects with sort of who I am as an artist. Okay. Now, another way that you can strengthen your landscape images. We've talked about subject identification and then including supporting elements. And this is a great way to help photos come alive. Photos are only two-dimensional. And so we as landscape photographers have that extra task on hand that we need to accomplish. And that's trying to create that three-dimensional sort of feel in an image. And so as a photographer, you can do that by looking for foreground elements, middle ground elements, and then background elements. And, both of these images are examples of that. I was able to find these flowers, and then I have this beautiful middle ground in the river, and then of course the mountains are my background. Now the next scene with the reflection, this one, I could have very easily cropped out these foreground rocks and just gone for the beautiful reflection and then the background. But by including that foreground, it just infuses a little bit more of a step. So I step into my frame and I see the foreground, and then I step back and I step back. So it creates that three-dimensional feel and really helps images come alive and connect in a stronger way with your viewer. Now, of course, there are more compositional elements, and I could talk about composition for days, but there's rule of thirds, there's perspective, there's framing, there's leading lines, there's balance, of course, there's reflection, and I really enjoy challenging myself to infuse different types of composition. And, that sort of, I propose that to you too, is that in your own landscape photography, if you have some favorite compositional elements that you like to use, we'll capture those images, but then go beyond that and pull out some compositional elements that you're not as comfortable with and give them a try and see if they fit into your style as a photographer. Because it's amazing what you can learn when you experiment and you try new things out. Now, I've showed you a lot of wide angle views tonight, and so sometimes I will get, well, Gina, you have it easy. You have the most beautiful mountains in your backyard. Yeah, I do, true. But I want you to know that landscape photography doesn't have to be expansive. There is incredible beauty in this world. And, the simple creek that you walk by on your daily walk, those aspens that maybe not in Texas, but, a little bit northern, those aspens that change color in the fall, they're gorgeous, and smaller frames and smaller things can be just as impactful. And that's one of the things I love about being a landscape photographer, is it's given me the ability to immerse myself in so much goodness and beauty. And I'll be having a bad day and I'll take my dog for a walk, and I'll just notice like the flittering of the leaves in the trees, or the way the light beam is coming through a cloud, and it brings me so much joy. And even if you're not photographing things, nature is so wonderful, and it does so many wonderful things to us. And I hope that you embrace that, and you fall in love with the passion that I know is within photography and landscape photography. Okay, I think we're almost time here, but let's quickly review. So today I shared with you that some of the lessons that I needed to learn moving from photographer to landscape photographer was simply there is a little bit of equipment or gear needs as a landscape photographer. Camera settings were different for me, and I definitely needed to learn those and master those in order to help me create solid, well-exposed images that I'm proud to show off and to display in print. And then I also had to learn how to properly create a landscape scene. And I had to understand the importance of subject identification, as well as the integral and very important role that composition has in landscape photography. Okay. All right, so we're pretty much at the end here. I'm going to very quickly share a little bit about what I offer as a landscape photography mentor and teacher here in the Canadian Rockies. I do offer in-person retreats here out of Banff, Alberta, and I offer ladies only as well as mixed gender small group hands-on retreats in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. And I also have some online learning opportunities. I have 2 different workshops right now. I have manual mode for the landscape photographer for those who are interested in improving their manual mode, or manual exposure mode skills. And then I also have my big, the art in landscape photography workshop, which pretty much covers everything that I know about landscape photography. And currently that is offered a few times a year. And it is a 4-week online workshop. And I also have some other really exciting opportunities in the works. And so if you would like, you can certainly follow me. You can find me at www.ginayeo.com. I do have a free downloadable, which is displayed here on the screen. It's just 5 simple secrets to taking amazing photos. It's a free downloadable. And then if you do sign up and choose to download that, you will be added to my email list. And I send out weekly free email tips to everybody on my email list in my community. And Linda had already mentioned this, but you can find me on Instagram at @GinaYeo_photography. And I also run a hub. It's called She Creates with Light. And I feature various different images on that hub celebrating photography and light. Okay, so thank you so much for having me here tonight. Thank you, Linda, for inviting me to the Happiness Hour. And yeah, I love talking about landscape photography and my passion. And I hope that photography fills you with as much joy as it fills me with. So yes, thanks again.
Thank you so much, Gina. I'm going to get you to take down your screen so I can properly thank you for coming. And this was such a comprehensive presentation, and you covered so much. And I mean, I think the more information people have, the more it's just tools. So thank you for doing that and sharing. Didn't see any questions, which surprises me, but at the same time, there's a lot of nice comments about your images, and that's one of the things I'm like, show it bigger, show it there. So because some of these landscapes are just, I mean, I have never been to your part of Canada. I've only seen just a little bit on the other side. And mountains, Canadians,
Canadian Rocky Mountains.
Canadian Rocky.
I mean, it's, you know, it's, Linda, it's so expansive. You know, I have people come here and they're like, the images just don't do it justice. You know, it's not just a simple range. It is like 360 degrees views of incredibleness. And yeah, it's you have to come. You've got to come one day. It's,
well, like I told you earlier, don't extend that because I might show up and go, I'm here.
That's okay.
But if I do come, I'll definitely tap on your shoulder and just say, I'm giving you a warning, I'm coming through. Run away, lock your doors, walk to me if you need to, but I will come one day. Guys, you can connect with Gina through her website at ginayeo.com and on Instagram at ginayeo_photography. And I'm going to link her socials to this video when I post it to YouTube. Next week, wildlife photographer Marianne Karen joins us from Salt Lake City with her beautiful images and stories in her presentation, Bird Photography and Great Salt Lake. Until next time, go out and create something beautiful, and I hope that we see you again soon.